The morning Maeve Conley was thrown out of her grandmother's house, the temperature in Elk Hollow, West Virginia, had already dropped below freezing, and the first hard frost of 1937 was silvering the dead grass along the road. She stood on the porch with a flour sack holding everything she owned: 2 dresses, a wool blanket with moth holes, a copy of Practical Botany for Rural Schools she'd taken from the library and never returned, and a photograph of her mother standing in a garden, smiling at someone the camera couldn't see. Behind her, the screen door slammed and the bolt turned. "Don't come back here," her grandmother's voice called through the wood. "I won't have a thief under my roof." Maeve had not stolen anything. What she had done was worse in the eyes of Elk Hollow. She had embarrassed Harlan Sutter, the owner of the general store, the coal company office, and most of the rental houses along the creek, including the one her grandmother lived in for $2 a month. Harlan's son, Dale, 17 and already thick with his father's arrogance, had cornered Maeve behind the schoolhouse and tried to kiss her. She'd broken his nose with her geography textbook. Dale told his father she had stolen candy from the store. Harlan Sutter told Maeve's grandmother that the rent would double unless the girl was gone by morning. And Cordelia Conley, 68 years old, already coughing through the nights with a rattle in her chest that no one needed a doctor to name, chose the roof over the girl. Maeve understood. She understood it the way she understood weather, not as something fair or unfair, but as something that happened and had to be survived. She was 16. Her mother had died of typhoid when she was 9. Her father had gone to find work in Pennsylvania and never come back. She'd been living with Cordelia for 7 years, doing the washing, tending the garden, reading every book she could find by candlelight after her grandmother fell asleep. The people of Elk Hollow considered her strange. She asked questions at church that made the pastor uncomfortable. She spent hours in the woods identifying plants with a focus that struck others as unnatural for a girl. She talked about soil composition. Nobody in Elk Hollow talked about soil composition. The other girls her age were already being courted, learning to keep house, learning to shrink themselves into the shapes their mothers had worn before them. Maeve had no interest in shrinking. Now she was on the road with a flour sack and nowhere to be. If you want to find out how Maeve Conley survived that winter and built something that would eventually save not just herself, but the very woman who locked the door behind her, subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because what this girl created in the mountains of West Virginia became something nobody in Elk Hollow, or 3 counties beyond it, had ever seen before. The road out of Elk Hollow ran 2 directions. East went down to the valley, to the rail line, to the possibility of a mill town that might need another pair of hands. West went up into the mountains, into the Monongahela forest, where the ridges folded over themselves like the pages of a closed book, and the hollows between them held secrets that even the old-timers only half remembered. Maeve went west. She didn't go west because she had a plan. She went west because Dale Sutter's father owned everything to the east, and because the mountains, unlike people, had never looked at her as though she were a problem to be solved. She walked for the better part of that day, following a logging road that grew narrower as the oaks and hemlocks pressed closer. By afternoon, the road wasn't a road at all anymore, just a pair of ruts being slowly consumed by ferns and rhododendron. Twice she thought she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find nothing but the forest watching her go with its ancient, patient indifference. It was late October. She had perhaps 3 weeks before the real cold came. She had no food, no tools, no money, and no one expecting her anywhere on earth. That first night, she sheltered under a rock overhang she found by stumbling into it in the dark. She pulled the moth-eaten blanket around her shoulders and listened to the forest settle into its nocturnal rhythms. The creek somewhere below, an owl calling from a dead tree, the wind moving through the canopy like the breathing of something enormous and indifferent. She didn't cry. She had learned years ago that crying didn't change the temperature or fill the stomach, and she had never been a girl who spent energy on things that didn't work. She slept badly and woke with the dawn. Her body ached. Her fingers were stiff with cold, but there was something else too. A faint warmth rising from somewhere below the overhang. A softness in the air that didn't match the October morning. She followed it. Below the rock shelf, the hillside dropped steeply into a narrow hollow she hadn't been able to see in the dark. And at the bottom of that hollow, rising from a crack in the layered sandstone, a spring was flowing. Not cold mountain water, warm water. Steam curled from its surface in the early light like smoke from a chimney. The spring pooled in a natural basin about 12 feet across before overflowing into a creek that ran south between the ridges. The rocks around the basin were dark with mineral deposits, iron, sulfur, something that tinged the stone with bands of orange and yellow, and the vegetation growing closest to the water was greener, more lush, than anything else on the mountainside. Ferns and mosses that should have been dormant were still unfurling in the warmth, and a thicket of watercress grew at the edge of the overflow, bright green and trembling in the steam. Maeve Conley had never heard of geothermal energy. She didn't know the word, but she knew what heat meant when you had no other source of it. She knelt beside that spring and put her hands in the water, and it was warm, not scalding, not boiling, but the temperature of a bath drawn by someone who cared about you. Maybe 105 degrees. She pulled her hands out and looked at the steam rising into the cold air, and she began to think. The hollow was sheltered on 3 sides by the mountain. The warm spring kept the immediate area several degrees warmer than the surrounding forest. There were flat stones, fallen timber, and dense rhododendron thickets that broke the wind. It wasn't a home, but it was a possibility. For the first 2 weeks, Maeve nearly died 3 times. Once from a fall on the wet rocks that opened a gash on her shin. She had to pack with sphagnum moss and bind with strips torn from her second dress. Once from eating berries she wasn't sure about. They looked like service berries, but weren't, and she spent a night and a day too sick to move, curled beside the warm spring with her stomach trying to turn itself inside out. Once from a rainstorm that turned to sleet and soaked everything she had, leaving her shaking so violently she couldn't grip anything with her hands. Each time, she crawled back to the warm spring, lay beside it on the heated rocks, and let the earth itself pull her back from the edge. She was learning. Every failure was a lesson her body recorded, even when her mind was too exhausted to take notes. By the 3rd week, she had built a lean-to against the rock face, using fallen branches and pine boughs, angled to trap the rising warmth from the spring. It wasn't enough. The lean-to leaked wind and rain from every angle, but she kept improving it, adding layers, weaving rhododendron branches into the gaps, studying how the wind moved through the hollow and adjusting her walls to deflect it. She discovered that if she heated flat stones in the spring's overflow and brought them inside her shelter, they held warmth for hours. She discovered that the mud near the spring, mixed with dried grass, could be packed between stones and dried to something almost like mortar. The idea for the underground cabin came to her in November, during the first real snowfall. She had been watching the way the warm air from the spring created a pocket of relative comfort in the hollow. She thought about the root cellars she had seen at farms in the valley, how they stayed cool in summer and above freezing in winter because the earth itself was an insulator. She thought about the drawings in her botany book of greenhouse designs and about a passage she had read 3 times about the way the Romans had heated their bathhouses by running warm water beneath the floors. And she thought about the hillside above the spring, where the slope was steep and the soil was thin over the sandstone. What if she didn't build on top of the ground? What if she built into it? She started digging with a flat stone and a stick hardened in the fire she'd learned to coax from a hand drill. It was brutal work. Her hands blistered, bled, and blistered again until the calluses came in thick enough that the stones couldn't cut them anymore. She dug into the hillside just above the spring, following a natural cleft in the rock where the sandstone had already fractured. She found that the deeper she went, the warmer the earth became. The hot spring's heat radiated through the rock, warming the ground for yards in every direction. Over 6 weeks of work that would have broken most adults, Maeve hollowed out a space roughly 8 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and 5 feet tall. Not enough to stand in, but enough to sit, sleep, and stay alive. She lined the walls with flat stones stacked without mortar, then packed the gaps with the spring mud and grass mixture that hardened into something surprisingly solid. She built a frame for the entrance from the straightest saplings she could find and covered the front with layers of pine boughs, bark, and a final layer of the mud and grass mixture that dried into a crude but effective door. She ran a shallow channel from the warm spring's overflow along the base of one wall, letting the heated water flow through the cabin before draining out the other side. The effect was extraordinary. Even on the coldest nights, when the air outside dropped well below 0, the inside of her underground cabin stayed above 40 degrees, not warm by any standard of comfort, but warm enough to survive. She ate what the mountain offered and what her botany book helped her identify: hickory nuts, black walnuts, the starchy roots of cattails from a boggy area downstream, dried berries, and the occasional rabbit she caught in snares. She learned to set through trial and error, losing more meals than she caught at first. She was thin. She was tired. She was sometimes so lonely that she spoke to the spring itself, thanking it for the heat the way she imagined someone might thank a mother. On the worst nights, she held her mother's photograph close to the warm water channel and talked to it, telling the woman in the picture about the things she was building, as though somewhere, somehow, her mother could hear. But she was alive. Winter settled over the mountains, and Maeve settled into it. She improved the cabin constantly, adding a smoke hole with a stone flue for the small fires she built for cooking, adding a sleeping shelf raised above the floor where the warmth collected, adding a storage alcove dug into the back wall for her dwindling food supplies. She wove a second blanket from strips of bark and dried grass that was rough and ugly, but held heat better than the moth-eaten wool she'd brought from Elk Hollow. She began to notice that the plants growing near the spring didn't die back in winter the way everything else did. The warmth created a microclimate. Mosses grew year-round. Certain ferns kept green fronds well into December. The thought that would eventually change everything came to her on a January morning so cold that the trees on the ridge above her were cracking like gunshots. She was looking at a patch of chickweed growing beside the warm channel she dug through her cabin. Chickweed, green, growing, in January, in West Virginia. If chickweed could grow here, what else could? She started with what she had: seeds from the dried berries she'd been eating, a few wizened potatoes she'd found at an abandoned homestead 2 ridges over, some wild onion bulbs. She cleared a patch of ground near the spring where the warmth was strongest and planted them. She built a crude cold frame over the patch using flat stones and sheets of bark, trapping the warm, moist air rising from the spring beneath them. Things grew. Not well, not fast, not abundantly, but they grew. In February, while the rest of West Virginia was locked under ice and snow, Maeve Conley had green shoots pushing up from warm soil beside a hot spring in a hollow nobody knew existed. It was in March of 1938 that she met Odell Fenton. Odell was 74 years old, a former coal miner whose lungs were slowly turning to white and whose wife had died 6 years earlier, leaving him alone in a cabin 4 miles down the mountain. He had known about the hot spring since he was a boy. His grandfather had called it the Devil's Kettle because the old people believed warm water coming from the earth was unnatural, a sign of something best left alone. Odell had never been superstitious. He came to the spring every few weeks to soak his aching joints in the warm water, and on a March morning, he followed the steam up the hollow and found a skinny girl with wild hair kneeling in a patch of green plants that had no business being green. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at what she'd built, the underground cabin, the warm water channel, the cold frames over the planting beds. And then he looked at her. "How long you been up here?" he asked. "Since October," she said. He sat down on a rock. He was quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice had something in it that Maeve hadn't heard directed at her in a long time. It was respect. "You did all this yourself? There wasn't anyone else to do it." Odell Fenton became the first person in 5 months to treat Maeve Conley as a human being worth knowing. He came back 3 days later with a sack of cornmeal, a hand axe, a bag of seed potatoes, and a pouch of bean seeds his wife had saved the year she died. He didn't offer charity. He offered a trade, seeds and tools for the right to keep soaking his joints in the warm spring. Maeve accepted. It was the first fair deal anyone had offered her since her mother died. Over the following months, Odell taught her things her botany book couldn't: how to read the soil by its color and smell, how to know when frost was truly done by watching the behavior of the dogwood trees, how to set a proper post, how to split wood along the grain so it wouldn't fight you, how to notch logs for a corner joint that would hold without nails. In return, Maeve read to him from her book, and he listened with the attention of a man who had spent his whole life working with his hands and had always wondered what the words were for what he already knew. Together, they expanded what Maeve had begun. They dug a second underground growing space, larger, deeper, with a proper stone-lined channel that circulated warm spring water beneath raised planting beds. They covered the top with a frame of saplings and layers of oiled canvas Odell brought from his cabin, creating a structure that was part root cellar, part greenhouse, entirely heated by the earth. They called it the warm room. The name was simple, but what it represented was not. It was proof that a 16-year-old girl with a botany book and a 74-year-old man with ruined lungs could build something that defied the season itself. By the summer of 1938, the warm room was producing food: beans, potatoes, squash, cabbages, tomatoes, herbs. The warm spring water and the sheltered hollow created growing conditions that extended the season by weeks on either side of what was normal for the mountain elevation. By the following winter, Maeve had enough stored and enough still growing in the warm room to feed herself through the cold months without the desperation of the year before. She even had surplus: jars of preserved tomatoes, crocks of sauerkraut, braids of dried beans hanging from the ceiling of her underground cabin like strange ornaments. Word spread the way it does in mountain communities, slowly, through the people who walk the ridges and trade gossip at crossroads stores. A hunter passing through the hollow saw the green plants and told someone at the store in Cotter's Gap that someone told someone else. By the spring of 1939, people began appearing at the edge of the hollow, cautious and curious, looking at the underground structures and the growing beds and the girl who had built them. Some came to stare, some came to scoff, but a few came to learn. Maeve turned no one away. She explained her methods to anyone who asked, how the warm spring water could be channeled through growing beds, how underground and semi-underground structures stayed warmer than above-ground ones, how cold frames and thermal mass could extend the season even without a hot spring. She gave away seeds. She gave away seedlings. She gave away knowledge with the generosity of someone who understood that knowledge was the one thing that multiplied when you shared it. By 1940, 3 families from neighboring hollows had built their own versions of Maeve's growing systems, adapted, modified, made their own, but rooted in what she had taught them. A network was forming. People who had been barely surviving on played-out hillside farms were growing food through the winter for the first time in their lives. It was in the autumn of 1940 that Maeve learned her grandmother was dying. The news came through Odell, who had heard it from a man at the crossroads store. Cordelia Conley's cough had become pneumonia. The house she lived in, Harlan Sutter's rental, had a failed chimney and broken windows that Sutter refused to fix because the old woman was behind on rent. She was freezing in her own bed, and nobody in Elk Hollow was lifting a hand because nobody in Elk Hollow wanted to cross the Sutter family. Maeve didn't hesitate. She didn't debate. She didn't weigh the justice of helping the woman who had locked the door behind her 3 years ago. She went down the mountain to Elk Hollow the next morning. The town looked smaller than she remembered, meaner, more fragile. The paint was peeling from the company store. The road was rutted and neglected. She walked to her grandmother's house and found it exactly as bad as she'd been told. The windows stuffed with rags, the chimney cracked and leaking smoke into the room instead of drawing it out. Cordelia in her bed, under every blanket in the house, still shivering, her breathing a wet, shallow rattle. The room smelled of sickness and cold ash. "Who's there?" the old woman whispered. "It's Maeve, grandmother." Cordelia's eyes opened. They were glassy with fever, but recognition flared in them, and something else. Shame. "You shouldn't have come back." "Probably not," Maeve said. "But here I am." She worked for 3 days. She sealed the windows with clay and strips of canvas. She repaired the chimney with the same techniques she'd used to build in the hollow, mortaring the cracks with a mixture of clay, sand, and ash that set hard. She brought food, preserved vegetables, dried beans, smoked rabbit, and made broth that she fed to Cordelia by the spoonful. She heated stones in the fireplace and packed them around her grandmother's body to hold warmth through the night. She did everything she had learned from the mountain, applied to a drafty house in a dying town. On the 4th day, Harlan Sutter appeared at the door. He was older than she remembered, heavier, his face mapped with the small broken veins of a man who drank more than he should. He looked at Maeve as though seeing a ghost. "Heard you were back," he said. "You're not welcome here." "I'm not here for you," Maeve said. "I'm here for my grandmother. When she's well enough to travel, I'm taking her with me." "Travel where? You've got nothing." "I've got more than you think, Mr. Sutter." He might have pressed the matter, but by then, some of the women in town had gathered behind him, women who had heard about the girl in the mountains, about the underground growing rooms, about the food she'd shared during the hardest winter anyone could remember. One of them, Martha Jessup, whose own family had been fed by seeds Maeve had given away the year before, spoke up. "Let her be, Harlan. She's not hurting anything." Another voice joined Martha's. Then another. Sutter looked at the women behind him and calculated, the way men like him always calculate, the cost of pushing further against a tide that was no longer running in his direction. He left without another word. 2 weeks later, Maeve carried her grandmother up the mountain trail to the hollow. Cordelia was too weak to walk the whole way, and Maeve had to stop and rest every quarter mile, supporting the old woman's weight against her own body, adjusting the pack of supplies on her back, murmuring encouragement when Cordelia said she couldn't go on. It took most of a day. But when they arrived, Cordelia sat in the underground cabin, felt the warmth rising from the channeled spring water, looked at the warm room full of green growing things, and wept. "I'm sorry, child," she said. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you." "You did what you thought you had to," Maeve said. "It doesn't matter anymore." But it did matter, in the way that true things always matter. It mattered because Cordelia's apology was the first time anyone from Elk Hollow had admitted that what happened to Maeve was wrong. And it mattered because Maeve's forgiveness, offered simply, without conditions, without performance, was proof that the girl Elk Hollow had thrown away was larger than the town had ever been capable of imagining. Cordelia lived another 11 years in the hollow, her lungs slowly healing in the warm, humid air near the spring. She never fully recovered, but she never got worse either. She spent her last years helping Maeve in the growing rooms, sorting seeds with gnarled fingers, telling stories about Maeve's mother that Maeve had never heard before, how her mother had loved to sing while she gardened, how she had once grown a sunflower taller than the house, how she had said that the best thing about plants was that they never judged you for who your parents were. Cordelia became, at last, the grandmother she had been too frightened and too poor and too beaten down to be before. Odell Fenton died in the winter of 1943, peacefully, sitting in the warm water of the spring on a December morning. Maeve found him there at dawn, his face turned up to the steam, his expression so calm that for a moment she thought he was sleeping. He left Maeve his cabin, his tools, and a small parcel of land that included the hollow itself. He had owned it all along, a fact he'd never mentioned, perhaps because he wanted her to feel she had earned her place there through work rather than charity. The deed was already in her name. He had changed it 2 years before. In 1944, Maeve married Thomas Pruitt, a quiet man who had come to the hollow to learn her methods and stayed because he recognized in her something he had been looking for his whole life. A person who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be made to be. Together, they expanded the operation. They built 3 more underground growing rooms. They developed a system of channeling warm spring water through insulated pipes, clay pipes wrapped in straw and packed earth, to heat structures farther from the source. They experimented with crop varieties that thrived in the unique microclimate. By 1950, the Conley Pruitt Farm, as people had begun to call it, was producing food year-round and supplying fresh vegetables to families across 4 counties during months when nothing else was growing. Maeve never charged for knowledge. Anyone who came to learn was taught. She kept meticulous records of her methods in notebooks that eventually filled an entire shelf. Planting dates, soil temperatures, yield records, sketches of channel designs, notes on which varieties did best in the geothermal warmth. She corresponded with agricultural extension agents who were skeptical at first and astonished later. a professor from West Virginia University, visited in 1952 and wrote a paper about the geothermal growing techniques that was published in an agricultural journal. Maeve read it and found 2 errors, which she corrected in a letter the professor described as the most politely devastating correspondence he had ever received. She had 4 children. All of them learned to grow things before they learned to read, and all of them learned to read before most of the children in the county. She insisted on education the way she insisted on compost, as something essential to growth. Cordelia Conley died in 1951 at 82 years of age in the underground cabin where Maeve had first survived a winter alone. She died warm. Maeve buried her on the hillside above the spring, in a spot where the geothermal heat kept the ground from freezing even in the deepest cold, so that the earth would never be hard against her grandmother's bones. Harlan Sutter lost his store and most of his properties during the war years, when the young men who might have worked his mines left for the military and never came back. He died in 1956, alone and diminished, a man whose power had been borrowed from circumstances and who had nothing left when those circumstances changed. Maeve sent flowers to his funeral. Not everyone understood why. She didn't explain. Maeve Conley Pruitt lived until 1997, dying at the age of 76 in the house that Thomas had built over the original underground cabin, a house warmed by the same spring that had saved her life 60 years earlier. By then, the Hollow had become something of a landmark, not famous, not on any tourist map, but known among the people who mattered, the people who grew things and taught others to grow things and believed that knowledge shared was the only kind worth having. Her children continued the farm. Her grandchildren expanded it. The notebooks she kept were transcribed and shared through the county extension service. The professor's paper was cited in 3 textbooks. The techniques she pioneered, geothermal heating for season extension, underground growing structures, thermal mass cultivation, were adapted and used in places she never visited by people who never knew her name, but who ate in winter because of what she figured out beside a warm spring in the mountains of West Virginia. At her funeral, her oldest daughter read from one of Maeve's notebooks. The passage was simple, written in the careful handwriting of a woman who had taught herself penmanship by candlelight. The spring didn't care that I was 16. The soil didn't care that I was alone. The seeds didn't care that nobody believed in me. They just needed warmth and water and time, and they grew. I think people are like that too, if you let them. Here's what I think about when I think about Maeve Conley Pruitt. I think about how the same qualities that made Elk Hollow reject her curiosity, her stubbornness, her refusal to pretend she was less than she was, were the exact qualities that allowed her to survive, to build, and to eventually save the very people who had abandoned her. The town saw a difficult girl. The mountain saw a gardener. So here's my question for you. What is the thing about you that the people around you wish you would stop doing? The thing that makes you inconvenient, or strange, or too much? Because I wonder if that thing, that exact, specific thing, might be the seed of something extraordinary, not in spite of what makes you different, but because of it. Maeve Conley was thrown out into the cold at 16 with nothing but a flour sack and a book. She built a home in the earth. She grew food where nothing should have grown. She saved the woman who had abandoned her. She fed the community that had cast her out, and she did it all starting from nothing but warmth rising from the ground and the stubborn belief that she was worth more than the world had told her. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the seeds you might be carrying that haven't found their warm ground yet, hit subscribe for more stories. about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most remarkable life starts with the worst possible day. And sometimes the ground is warmer than anyone told you it would be.